Hi, I'm Bruce Baker, and this is another lecture in my History of New Orleans series. This is a lecture about James Eads and the mouth of the Mississippi River. So the main idea today is something fairly straightforward, I hope, that although the Mississippi River was the basis for the commercial prosperity of New Orleans, the very scale of the river made it difficult to navigate until James Eads built jetties to clear the sandbar at the mouth of the river in 1875. So I'll come back to the question of sort of how the scale of things affects all this, but before I do that, I wanted to think about this question of nature versus artifice, which is sort of one of the themes in Ari Kelman's book, A River and Its City. And there's a good quote on page 54 that I think is worth looking at. Although today we often place technology and pristine environments in opposition, the assemblymen of the city of New Orleans did not fret about setting a machine loose in the gardens of Louisiana. Instead, they hoped that artifice would improve rather than despoil the territory's riparian environment. The steamboat New Orleans could improve the river, render it docile, smooth its rough edges, leaving it a predictable venue hospitable to commerce. Now that quote is about the very beginnings of steamboat traffic on the river and how obviously that transforms the city's economy. But what we're talking about here is in a much later period, in the post-Civil War period, and it's really right at the point where sail is giving way to steam for transatlantic shipping. And the nature of the river has a profound effect on all of this. So it's important to think about the hydromorphology of the Mississippi River. And that simply means how the river behaves and how it sort of shapes the flow of water, but also crucially sediment. So the great thing about the Mississippi River for New Orleans is that the city sits at the base of the largest river system in North America that drains a third of the continental United States and so on and so forth. And all of the riches of the Mississippi River float down to New Orleans. However, the downside of that is that it's a huge river, and in addition to all of the grain and timber and all the various goods that are coming down the river in flatboats and later steamboats and so forth, that river is bringing a lot of sand and clay and mud and gravel and so forth with it. And we've talked a little bit at the beginning when we were thinking about why New Orleans is in precisely the place that it is, and we tried to understand a little bit anyway, enough for historians, maybe not for proper river geographers and so forth, but for historians we tried to understand how the nature of flooding and the sedimentation and so forth creates the natural levee that the city of New Orleans sits upon. Now we need to sort of come 100 miles down the river to the mouth of the river and think about how the process of the river creates an obstacle. So having created this great opportunity for this wonderful commercial city on the Mississippi River, the river then goes and throws a really significant obstacle up. So near the Gulf of Mexico, the river, as you can see from this 1852 map, splits into a number of different distributaries and outlets, and the ones that lead, the ones that are a sort of viable channel for a ship that lead out to actual open water are called passes, and there are three main ones here. The one in the middle is South Pass, the one on the left or the southwest is called Southwest Pass, and the other one that's really significant is called Pass à l'Outre. Now, what happens is that the river, carrying this huge load of sediment, the current slows down as it hits the open water of the Gulf. And this means that the sediment that had been carried along by the rapid moving current drops out and it creates a sandbar. And the sandbar often has as little as 12 feet of water. Now, bear in mind that the harbor of New Orleans is something like around 100 feet deep. So that drops to 12 feet, which really just isn't enough to get a ship across. This means that ships had to be towed across the river, or towed across the sandbar, and that causes delay and expense in shipping. Now, it also leads to all sorts of delays if the water levels are low. And one of the things that this creates, perhaps unsurprisingly, is a real business opportunity for the tugboats that tow the ships over the sandbar to exploit that opportunity. And there's a powerful tugboat cartel that basically rips off ships, and if you try to avoid them, then they do bad things and they strand your ship on the sandbar and things like that. It's something that I wrote about in my Journal of Southern History article in August of 2020. There are a lot of questions about what to do about this sandbar, because of course what happens is you sometimes get basically traffic jams on either side of the sandbar. You've got ships that are loaded that want to get out to sea and get where they're going, unable to get out of the mouth of the river. You have other ships coming in to deliver products and load cotton and grain and all these other things, and they're stuck in the Gulf and they can't get into the river. And the sandbar is just a huge problem and sort of ongoing obstacle. So how do you get rid of the sandbar? Well, one way would be to dredge it. That is to say, to get some sort of a digging thing off the bottom of a boat and dig all the mud up and put it somewhere else. If that sounds like a lot of work, it really is. Another idea that they come up with is to get the tugboats that are towing boats over the sandbar and to have them sort of drag harrows or rakes and stir the dirt up on the bottom and let this current carry it away. So that's another way that they try to deal with it. They also try sort of damming up the little passages and sort of outlets on the side and trying to keep most of the current in the middle going over the sandbar and have that sort of wash it out. And none of these things are very good solutions, and they kind of work, and they sort of get the bar reduced enough that you can get ships over it, but none of them really solve the problem. So by the time you get into the certainly into the 1860s and really sort of in the 1850s, there's a lot of enthusiasm about just going around the sandbar, about creating a canal that would run from Fort St. Philip to the English Turn, and just not worry about the sandbar and just sort of bypass it that way. The solution to it ultimately, though, comes from this guy, James B. Eads. So he's born in 1820 and grows up in St. Louis. His first sort of business is river salvage. So as we know, there are a lot of steamboats on the Mississippi River, and a lot of them are exploding, a lot of them are hitting snags and sinking, and they're carrying valuable cargo. So Eads sort of gets his start in business by personally diving down and retrieving the cargo and so forth. He sort of as part of this, he's a very mechanically gifted person and invents all sorts of things and sort of moves into what we would call civil engineering effectively. And he builds a bridge over the Mississippi River at St. Louis, starts in 1867, it's opened in 1874. And this is the first bridge south of the Missouri River. So when the Missouri River hits the Mississippi River, the Mississippi is obviously a much bigger river after that point. But Eads successfully builds this really technologically innovative bridge at St. Louis. So he really sort of makes his mark and establishes a reputation. And Eads sort of inserts himself into this debate about what to do about the sandbar. And his idea is dredging is never going to work. Everything just sort of sinks back into the sandbar as quickly as you can dredge it out. Harrowing doesn't work. These sort of cofferdams on the side channels, none of those work. And he sort of realizes that really the only force that's strong enough to clear the sandbar out is the river itself. And the way he proposes to do this is to build jetties. So he's going to build long, straight jetties at the mouth and narrow the river down so that the force of the current is not being dissipated in a lot of different directions off to the side, but it's channeled in one straight sort of shot. So it's a little bit like taking a garden hose and putting your thumb over the end of it to sort of narrow the space that the water can come out, and it increases the force by which it comes out. So that's essentially what he does. He manages to convince Congress that this is a good idea, and they authorize him to build it, and he's only going to get paid if it works. And indeed, he does build it in 1875. It's up and running by the 1876 cotton season, and by 1879, the construction on the whole thing is finished. Now, what I think is interesting here is a couple of things. So, one of those is the role of the federal government here. And it's important to remember that this decision about what to do about the sandbar and Eads jetties and so forth is happening during Reconstruction. And I would say that, we think about Reconstruction in New Orleans, and we think about New Orleans as a significant location in Reconstruction, partly because it's the political center of Louisiana, and there's all sorts of complex and wild things happening in Louisiana, and there's the New Orleans massacre of 1866 that's fairly decisive in affecting the shape of national legislation and so forth that leads into congressional reconstruction. But I would encourage us to think more about the river itself during Reconstruction. And part of this is because rivers are a center for federal power, right? So admiralty jurisdiction is a federal jurisdiction, and there's some interesting ways, I won't go into it here, but there's some interesting ways in which admiralty jurisdiction bangs up against local state court jurisdictions. And what we see in this example with Eads is, again, another federal function. Ports and sort of maintaining ports and improving navigation and so forth had always been a federal function. And we see the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is involved in this. It's interesting to note that in 1879, so just a couple of years after Reconstruction decisively ends, a couple of post-Reconstruction Redeemer political figures really take the lead in creating the Federal Mississippi River Commission, which is kind of branches off of the Corps of Engineers and reports directly to the Secretary of War. So again, it's no coincidence, I would say, that we have this sort of federal issue going on, but then once Reconstruction is over, and once Redeemers, white supremacist Democrats, are back in political control, then they're more interested in working in a constructive way with the federal government because they don't see the federal government as challenging their local power within the states. Or at least that's my sense of it. The other thing I would say is that I think it's probably fair to say when we think about this question of sort of what's wrong with New Orleans, what's wrong with the New Orleans economy in the post-Civil War period, why are they so disorganized, why don't they get railroads why isn't New Orleans Galveston, which has got a real go-get-'em attitude and is doing all sorts of great things and thriving and so forth, and New Orleans is just sort of like sitting around declining and so on. I would say that a lot of energy was expended on dealing with the river's navigational obstructions, and it distracted energy and focus and just time from projects to improve transport infrastructure going out from New Orleans. So, in other words, people worried about the sandbar and just sort of assumed that goods were going to keep floating down the river as they always had, and that their problem wasn't getting goods to New Orleans, Their problem was this sandbar, as it had been for 30 years or so. And a lot of energy and activity and discussion in the newspapers and so on goes into this question of how do we deal with the sandbar? How do we get the goods out of New Orleans? How do we get ships into the port of New Orleans across the sandbar and so forth? And in a way, we could say that they're sort of looking at that end of the river, and what they're neglecting is the rest of the transportation structure. And the question really ultimately isn't how are the goods going to get out of New Orleans and off to sea and out to all the various places they're going. The real pressing question, which they take their eye off of, is how do we make sure that the goods get to New Orleans in the first place? So I think that's a fairly significant thing, and I think that this question of the sandbar is quite important to the economic history of New Orleans for just those reasons. And anyway, I hope that's interesting.